The room had been loud just moments earlier. Cameras flashed like distant lightning. Reporters spoke over one another, questions overlapping in a familiar chaos Taehyung had learned to ignore over the years. Interviews had become routine. Sit straight, smile when appropriate, answer carefully, move on. But something felt off that day. The air felt heavier, denser, as if even the walls were listening too closely. Taehyung sat back in his chair, hands resting loosely on his knees, posture relaxed on the surface. Inside, he was alert, always was. He had learned long ago that moments rarely announce themselves before changing everything. Across the room, Jungkook sat forward, hands loosely clasped, eyes calm but distant, like someone standing at the edge of a quiet storm. Taehyung noticed it immediately. He always did. Jungkook's stillness had a particular weight when something mattered. Around them, the presence of BTS filled the space even when no one spoke. Namjoon's steady composure shaped the rhythm of the room. Seokjin's quiet confidence anchored it. Yoongi's sharp awareness lived in the pauses between questions. Hosok's warmth lingered in the easy smiles. Jimin's emotional sensitivity hummed just beneath the surface. And Taehyung felt himself there too, even before his name was spoken. The interviewer flipped a page, cleared their throat, and asked the question. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't scandalous, just careful curiosity wrapped in neutrality, a question about Jungkook. Taehyung felt the shift before anyone reacted. The room tightened like a held breath. He didn't move. He didn't look at Jungkook right away. He didn't need to, he could feel it. Jungkook froze. Only for a second, but it was enough. Cameras adjusted. A producer leaned forward. Somewhere behind the lens, someone stopped typing. Taehyung's jaw tightened slightly, though his expression remained composed. He watched Jungkook lower his gaze, then lift it again, something firm settling behind his eyes. Taehyung had seen Jungkook face stadiums, pressure, expectations that could crush most people. But this was different. This wasn't about performance. This was personal. When you've been with someone through everything, Jungkook began slowly, his voice steady but lower than before, through days when nothing makes sense and nights when you question why you're still standing, that's not something you explain in a headline. Silence followed. Not the awkward kind, the heavy kind, the kind that presses against your ears until you're aware of your own breathing. Taehyung didn't look away. He felt something shift inside him, subtle but undeniable. Pride, tension, protectiveness all layered together. He stayed still, grounded, letting Jungkook speak without interruption. This wasn't his moment to enter. It was his moment to hold space. Jungkook exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath longer than he realized. People like to frame BTS as 7 individuals tied together by success, he continued. But that's never been the truth. Taehyung felt his chest tighten at that, not painfully, intimately. He listened as Jungkook spoke about Namjoon as the compass, Seokjin as quiet strength, Yoongi as understanding pain without words, Hosok as carrying light like responsibility, Jimin as feeling everything too deeply. And then Jungkook paused. The room leaned in without realizing it. And Taehyung, Jungkook said, voice softer now, has always been the mirror, the one who reflects parts of me I don't say out loud. Taehyung's fingers curled slightly against his knee. He didn't smile, he didn't react outwardly, but something inside him steadied, anchored. Jungkook wasn't performing, he wasn't crafting an image, he was choosing honesty even if it cost him comfort. Some relationships, Jungkook continued, aren't meant to be dissected, they're meant to be lived. No one interrupted him. They couldn't. Taehyung watched the way Jungkook's composure wavered just enough to be real. Not dramatic, not fragile, human. He knew how much control it took to allow that much truth in a room designed to consume it. There are things, Jungkook said quietly now, that belong to us alone. Not because we're hiding something, but because some truths lose their meaning when they're turned into noise. The silence deepened. Taehyung felt eyes shift toward him. He didn't acknowledge them. He kept his gaze forward, calm, unreadable. He understood the weight of what had just been said. Jungkook had drawn a boundary without raising his voice, and that boundary was loud. When the interview finally moved on, the energy in the room didn't reset. It lingered, thick and unresolved. Taehyung stood as they wrapped, movements unhurried. He caught Jungkook's reflection in the dark glass panel across the room. Their eyes met briefly. No words passed between them. None were needed. In the hallway, the noise of production resumed, headsets crackling, footsteps echoing. But the silence followed them anyway, trailing like an unfinished sentence. Namjoon waited near the exit. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded once. Taehyung nodded back, understanding flowing easily between them. Seokjin leaned against the wall nearby, arms crossed. "You did well," Seokjin said, voice calm, factual. Taehyung glanced toward Jungkook, who gave a faint, grateful smile. Yoongi sat nearby, head slightly lowered, eyes sharp beneath his cap. "People hear what they want," Yoongi muttered. Taehyung knew that truth better than most. Hoseok appeared next, his usual brightness softened, placing a hand briefly on Jungkook's shoulder. Jimin followed, eyes searching Jungkook's face instinctively. "Are you okay?" Jimin asked softly. Jungkook hesitated, then nodded. Taehyung watched it all quietly. He wasn't there yet, not physically, and somehow that absence felt intentional. He didn't rush forward. Their connection had never needed immediacy. It lived in patience, in timing. Later in the waiting room, phones buzzed relentlessly. Notifications stacked. Headlines were already forming. Taehyung didn't check his phone. He didn't need to. When he finally entered the room, Jungkook looked up. They held each other's gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "I watched," Taehyung said casually, as if commenting on the weather. Jungkook let out a quiet laugh. "Of course you did." They sat across from each other, space between them familiar, unthreatening. No explanations were demanded, no clarifications offered. Whatever the world thought it had witnessed didn't matter here, because what existed between them had never needed defense. The silence didn't end when the door closed behind them. It followed Taehyung down the hallway, clung to the corners of the waiting room, settled into his chest like something unfinished. He sat back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the armrest, expression neutral to anyone watching. Years of practice had taught him how to look unaffected. Inside, the noise was different. Phones vibrated relentlessly on the table between them. Notifications stacked faster than anyone could read. Taehyung didn't reach for his. He already knew what was happening outside those walls. He could almost hear the headlines forming, feel the speculation sharpening itself into something ready to be thrown. Jungkook leaned back across from him, gaze lowered, shoulders relaxed in a way that only came after something heavy had already been released. Taehyung watched him quietly, not protectively, not anxiously, just attentively. "You didn't hesitate," Taehyung said after a moment, voice calm. Jungkook looked up surprised. "I didn't plan to," he admitted. That answer stayed with Taehyung longer than he expected. Not planned meant honest, and honesty in rooms like that was dangerous. The others filtered in slowly. Namjoon entered first, tablet in hand, eyes scanning briefly before settling on the two of them. He said nothing, but the tension in his shoulders eased just slightly. Seokjin followed, already halfway into a joke before deciding against it. Yoongi dropped into a chair near the wall, eyes half-lidded but alert. Hoseok hovered near Jungkook, warmth quiet but present. Jimin sat close without thinking, instinctively bridging space. No one spoke about the interview. They didn't need to. The world outside was doing enough talking for all of them. When they finally stood to leave, Taehyung moved beside Jungkook without announcing it. Their shoulders brushed briefly. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't dramatic. It was grounding. The van ride back was unusually quiet. City lights blurred past the windows, stretching into soft streaks of white and gold. Taehyung rested his head back against the seat, eyes half-lidded, listening to the low hum of motion. Across from him, Jungkook stared out the window, unreadable but present. Namjoon broke the silence first. Tomorrow will be louder. It wasn't a warning, just an observation. Taehyung exhaled slowly through his nose. He didn't look at Jungkook when he spoke. Louder doesn't always mean stronger. Seokjin glanced at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. Yoongi nodded almost imperceptibly. They'll pull meaning from places where it doesn't belong, Yoongi said. Taehyung finally turned his head then, eyes finding Jungkook's reflection in the dark glass. Jungkook met his gaze briefly, then looked away, jaw set. "You okay?" Taehyung asked quietly. Jungkook hesitated. "Yeah." It wasn't a lie, it just wasn't complete. Taehyung accepted it anyway. Back at the dorm, the atmosphere shifted. Shoes were kicked off. Jackets dropped. Familiar routines resumed like muscle memory. The outside world felt distant now, muffled behind walls that had seen too many versions of them to care about headlines. Taehyung lingered in the kitchen, hands resting on the counter, listening to the sounds of the others moving through the space. Water running, laughter erupting briefly, Namjoon's low voice grounding the room. Jungkook joined him a moment later, leaning against the opposite counter. "People are going to talk," Taehyung said, not looking at him. "They always do," Jungkook replied. Taehyung glanced up then, eyes steady. "This time it's because you meant what you said." Jungkook swallowed. "I didn't think about it." "I know," Taehyung said softly. "That's why it landed." The words hung between them, unclaimed but understood. Later that night, Taehyung lay awake longer than usual. The room was dark, quiet except for the distant sounds of movement elsewhere in the dorm. His phone buzzed once on the bedside table. He didn't check it. He already knew. Control, he thought, wasn't about silence. It was about knowing what you were willing to lose. Morning came too quickly. Light slipped through the curtains, pale and unassuming, as if unaware of the storm waiting outside. Taehyung woke before his alarm, the way he often did when his mind refused to fully rest. He lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet, then sat up slowly. The headlines were unavoidable. He didn't scroll far. He didn't need to. Words like tense, emotional, unexpected repeated themselves in different orders. Some praised Jungkook's honesty. Others hunted for implications that hadn't been offered. Taehyung set the phone down. In the common area, the others were already gathered. Namjoon stood near the table, calm but focused. Seokjin skimmed his phone with an expression that suggested he was already tired of it. Yoongi stared into his coffee like it might confess something. Hosok paced lightly. Jimin watched everyone at once. Jungkook sat quietly at the edge of the couch. Taehyung crossed the room and sat beside him without comment. "We'll handle it," Namjoon said evenly, not as reassurance but as fact. Taehyung believed him. Later during rehearsal, Taehyung felt it. Not the pressure, the crack. It came in small ways. In the way his chest tightened when Jungkook's name echoed through the speakers during a run-through. In the way his focus slipped for half a second too long. In the way his jaw clenched without permission. He had spent years mastering restraint, smiling through questions, deflecting without lying, holding space without claiming it. But today, something in him resisted being contained. During a break, Jungkook caught him starring. "You good?" Jungkook asked. Taehyung laughed quietly. "You sound surprised." Jungkook hesitated. "You're quieter than usual." Taehyung wiped sweat from the back of his neck, considering the answer. "I'm thinking." "That's dangerous," Jungkook teased lightly. Taehyung met his eyes then, expression unreadable. "Not thinking is worse." The show that night was powerful in a restrained way. The crowd roared, lights blazed, energy surged. Taehyung moved through it all with practiced precision. But underneath the choreography, something else pulsed. Awareness, presence, a refusal to disappear into performance. At one point mid-song, he caught Jungkook's eye. It wasn't planned, it wasn't dramatic. Just recognition. After the show, backstage buzzed with adrenaline and relief. Laughter spilled freely. Tension finally loosened its grip. Taehyung stood slightly apart, watching it all, absorbing instead of reacting. "You didn't look for the crowd tonight," Jungkook said, stepping beside him. Taehyung raised an eyebrow. "Was I supposed to?" Jungkook shook his head. "No, you looked like you already knew where you were." That comment stayed with him. Later, alone again, Taehyung sat by the window, city lights reflecting faintly in the glass. He thought about how often he had mistaken control for distance, silence for strength. What Jungkook had done hadn't been losing control. It had been choosing alignment. And for the first time, Taehyung felt something unfamiliar and unsettling. The realization that he wasn't sure, he wanted to keep holding himself back. Not anymore. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, threading itself through schedules, interviews, rehearsals, and transitions between cities. Taehyung felt it in the way questions started circling closer, in the pauses reporters left open just a little longer than necessary, in the way Jungkook's name hovered unspoken but present. He had always been good at reading rooms. And lately, rooms were watching him. At the next press stop, the setup was smaller, fewer cameras, softer lights, supposedly controlled. Taehyung sat with one leg crossed over the other, posture relaxed, hands resting loosely in his lap. To anyone observing, he looked exactly like he always did, composed, thoughtful, distant in that familiar, elegant way. Inside, something was fraying. The questions began harmlessly enough. Music, touring, growth, reflections on longevity. Taehyung answered with ease, voice smooth, measured, offering insight without giving too much away. He had mastered that balance years ago. Then the interviewer shifted. They didn't say Jungkook's name immediately. They didn't have to. "There's been a lot of discussion lately," the interviewer said carefully, eyes flicking up for just a moment too long, about the dynamics within the group, about moments that felt unexpected. Taehyung felt it then. Not anger, not fear. Resistance. He leaned back slightly, expression unreadable. "People see what they're ready to see," he replied calmly. The interviewer nodded, as if encouraged. "Specifically, your reaction during the recent interview. Many noticed how still you became when Jungkook was mentioned." The room tightened. Taehyung didn't answer right away. Silence stretched, cameras adjusted, someone shifted in their seat. He could have deflected. He could have smiled. He could have offered something poetic and distant, the kind of answer that sounded meaningful but said nothing. Instead, he felt something snap, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. "I wasn't still," Taehyung said, voice even but firm. "I was listening." The interviewer blinked. Taehyung continued, eyes steady now, no longer retreating behind softness. "There's a difference." The room went quiet. "When someone you've grown up with speaks honestly," he said, "you don't rush to fill the space. You don't interrupt it, you respect it." The interviewer hesitated. Some fans felt it was intense. Taehyung let out a slow breath through his nose. "Honesty often is," he replied, "especially when people aren't used to seeing it without filters." That was the moment. The moment the tone shifted. The interviewer glanced down at their notes, then back up. "Are you saying the public misinterpreted what happened?" Taehyung's jaw tightened, just slightly. "I'm saying," he said carefully, "that not everything is meant to be consumed." The silence that followed wasn't polite. It was stunned. Cameras continued rolling, but the energy in the room had changed completely. Taehyung felt it settle into his shoulders, heavy but grounding. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't lost control in the way people expected. But he had stopped accommodating. When the interview ended, the staff moved quickly, too quickly, as if speed could erase what had just occurred. Taehyung stood, nodding politely, thanking them out of habit more than intention. In the hallway, Namjoon was already waiting. He didn't speak at first, just studied Taehyung's face. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Taehyung nodded, "Yeah." Namjoon searched him for a moment longer, then he nodded back, "Good." Further down the hall, Jungkook waited. He didn't look anxious, he didn't look relieved. He looked aware. Taehyung stopped in front of him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the building flowed around them, voices, footsteps. Doors opening and closing. "You didn't have to do that," Jungkook said softly. Taehyung met his eyes. "I know." A pause. "But you did," Jungkook added. Taehyung's expression softened just a fraction. "Because I meant it." That answer landed differently. They walked together after that, shoulders aligned, pace unhurried. Neither of them mentioned headlines or reactions or consequences. They didn't need to. Those things would come whether acknowledged or not. Later that evening, the van was quieter than usual. Yoongi stared out the window, thoughtful. Hoseok hummed softly under his breath, trying to keep the atmosphere light. Jimin watched Taehyung with concern he didn't voice. Seokjin scrolled through his phone, unimpressed. "You rattled them," Seokjin said eventually, not looking up. Taehyung raised an eyebrow. "Was that obvious?" Seokjin smiled faintly. "You stopped being polite." Namjoon glanced back from the front seat. "And you didn't apologize for it." Taehyung leaned his head back against the seat. "I wasn't wrong." No one disagreed. That night, alone in his room, Taehyung finally checked his phone. Messages flooded in. Praise, criticism, speculation layered on speculation, clips already circulating, slow-motion analyses, headlines twisting tone into narrative. He set the phone face down on the bed. For the first time, the noise didn't feel like something he needed to manage. It felt distant. A soft knock came at the door. Taehyung opened it to find Jungkook standing there, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. "You good?" Jungkook asked. Taehyung nodded, "Yeah." Jungkook hesitated, "You sure?" Taehyung studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "I think I finally am." Jungkook returned the smile, smaller but real. They didn't talk long. They didn't need to. Some things had already been said publicly. Others didn't need words at all. When Jungkook left, Taehyung sat back down on the bed, exhaling slowly. Losing control, he realized, wasn't what had happened. What had happened was simpler and harder. He had stopped pretending that silence meant surrender. And once that line was crossed, there was no easy way back. The room was quiet now. But outside, the world was very loud. And for the first time, Taehyung wasn't bracing himself against it. He was standing in it. Steady, unmoving, unapologetic. The noise didn't peak immediately. It expanded. Taehyung noticed it the next morning, not through panic or urgency, but through absence. The absence of tension in his chest when he reached for his phone. The absence of that familiar instinct to prepare, to brace, to calculate what needed to be said next. He scrolled calmly. Clips from the interview were everywhere now. Slowed down, cropped, zoomed in on his eyes, his pauses, the subtle tightening of his jaw. Headlines tried to translate restraint into spectacle. Taehyung snaps. Taehyung shuts down interviewer. Taehyung breaks silence. None of them were quite right. He set the phone down again. In the common area, the others were already awake. Namjoon stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, reading through updates with the same measured calm he brought to everything. Seokjin leaned against the counter, unimpressed, sipping coffee. Yoongi sat nearby, hood up, already several thoughts ahead of the conversation. Hoseok moved through the space lightly, energy softened but present. Jimin glanced up the moment Taehyung entered, eyes searching his face. Jungkook was there too, seated quietly, scrolling without focus. No one rushed him with questions. That told Taehyung everything he needed to know. Management's aware, Namjoon said evenly. They'll let it breathe. Taehyung nodded. He hadn't expected anything else. They're going to ask again, Seokjin added casually, in different ways. Taehyung met his gaze. I know. Yoongi finally looked up. The difference is, now they know where the line is. That settled into the room like something solid. Later that day, the schedule moved on. Another venue, another sound check, another controlled chaos that felt oddly grounding. Taehyung moved through it all with a quiet steadiness that surprised even him. He wasn't numb. He wasn't detached. He was present. During rehearsal, he caught Jungkook watching him from across the room, not with concern, not with curiosity, with recognition. Taehyung raised an eyebrow slightly. Jungkook smiled. It was small, unguarded, fleeting, but it stayed with Taehyung longer than any headline. The next interview was unavoidable. Smaller room, softer lighting, fewer cameras, supposedly safer. Taehyung sat back, posture open but grounded. He answered the early questions with ease. Music, process, growth, reflection. His voice stayed even, unhurried. Then it came again. After your recent comments, the interviewer said carefully, do you worry about being misunderstood? Taehyung considered the question. Not how to answer it, but whether it deserved fear. No, he said simply. The interviewer blinked, not at all. Taehyung shook his head. Being misunderstood only hurts when you're still trying to explain yourself to everyone. Silence followed. Not heavy this time. Clear. When you know who you are, Taehyung continued, you don't need to correct every interpretation. You just keep moving. The interviewer nodded slowly, sensing the boundary, respecting it. The question passed. Afterward, as they stepped into the hallway, Jungkook walked beside him, unhurried. You sound lighter, Jungkook said. Taehyung glanced at him. You sound surprised. Jungkook laughed quietly. I am. Most people get tighter after moments like that. Taehyung exhaled. Maybe I was tired of shrinking. Jungkook didn't respond right away, then he nodded once. I get that. That night on stage, something shifted again. Not dramatically, not visibly. But Taehyung felt it in the way his body moved without resistance, in the way his voice carried without strain. He wasn't proving anything. He wasn't holding anything back either. Midway through the set, during a brief pause between songs, the crowd quieted naturally. Taehyung stood under the lights, aware of every breath, every second stretching gently instead of rushing forward. He glanced to the side of the stage. Jungkook met his eyes. There was no signal, no cue. Just understanding. After the show, backstage felt calmer than usual, less explosion, more reflection. The members moved slowly, savoring the afterglow instead of burning through it. You didn't disappear tonight, Hoseok said lightly. Taehyung smiled faintly. Neither did you. Jimin leaned briefly against his shoulder, grounding without comment. Yoongi gave a small nod of approval. Seokjin exaggerated a bow to the staff, breaking the seriousness just enough. Namjoon watched them all with quiet satisfaction. Later, alone again, Taehyung stood by the window of his hotel room, city lights stretching out below. He thought about the years he had spent mastering control. How often control had meant silence, distance, elegance without weight. This felt different. This felt like alignment. A message buzzed on his phone. Not words. Just presence. From Jungkook in the next room. Taehyung didn't reply. He didn't need to. Some connections didn't require confirmation. As he lay back on the bed, the weight of the past days finally began to lift, not because the world had gone quiet, but because he had stopped adjusting himself to it. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more analysis, more noise. But for the first time, Taehyung wasn't preparing answers. He was prepared to remain himself. And that, he realized, was louder than anything he could have said. Momentum didn't slow, it clarified. By the fifth day, Taehyung could feel the shift everywhere, not in the volume of attention but in its texture. The questions were still there, the speculation still spinning, but the tone had changed. There was caution now, a carefulness that hadn't existed before. People were no longer testing how far they could go. They were measuring where he stood. Taehyung noticed it during transit, in the way staff checked in without hovering, in the way producers framed conversations without pushing. Even the silence between schedules felt intentional rather than fragile. He welcomed it. In the van, Jungkook sat across from him, headphones on but eyes alert. Their gazes met briefly, then held. There was no urgency in it, no need to signal reassurance, just acknowledgement of shared space, shared history, shared understanding. That had become enough. The next major interview was live. There was no editing safety net, no chance to reshape tone after the fact. The lights were brighter, the set larger, the audience closer. Taehyung adjusted his mic calmly, posture relaxed, presence grounded. The host smiled. Professional but keenly aware of the atmosphere. "You've been at the center of a lot of conversation lately," they said. "How are you handling it?" Taehyung didn't rush. "Well," he replied, voice steady, "I stopped confusing attention with obligation." The host raised an eyebrow, meaning. "Just because people want access," Taehyung said, "doesn't mean I owe it to them." The audience murmured softly, not in shock but recognition. The host nodded. "And your relationships, do you feel pressure to explain them?" Taehyung glanced briefly offstage, where the familiar silhouettes of his members waited. He didn't linger. "No," he said, "real relationships don't need clarification." The words landed cleanly. No edge, no challenge. Just truth. After the broadcast, the hallway buzzed with low conversation, staff moving with efficiency sharpened by respect. Taehyung stepped off set and felt Jungkook fall into stride beside him, natural as breathing. "That was clean," Jungkook said quietly. Taehyung smiled. "I wasn't trying to be careful." Jungkook nodded. "That's why it worked." They stopped briefly near a window, city lights flickering beyond the glass. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of years pressed gently, not heavy, not suffocating, but present. "You know," Jungkook said, voice thoughtful, "people always think control means holding everything in." Taehyung met his gaze. "Sometimes it just means knowing what not to give away." That stayed between them. The following performance felt different again, not lighter, not heavier. Clearer. Taehyung moved across the stage with quiet certainty, no longer performing distance or intimacy, just inhabiting the moment as it came. When the crowd roared, he accepted it. When it softened, he let it breathe. During one song, he caught Jungkook's reflection in a monitor nearby. Their timing aligned without effort, their presence balanced without planning. The audience felt it. They always did. Backstage afterward, the energy was calm, almost reverent. Sweat dried, towels were passed, laughter surfaced gently without pressure to fill space. Namjoon approached Taehyung, voice low. "You've changed the frame." Taehyung tilted his head. "Did I?" Namjoon smiled slightly. "You didn't fight it, you didn't explain it, you defined it." That distinction mattered. Later, alone again, Taehyung scrolled briefly through reactions. Fewer extremes now, less outrage, More reflection. Fans talking not about what they wanted to know, but about what they were learning to respect. He closed the app. A knock came at the door. Jungkook again, familiar, unforced. "Walk," Jungkook asked. Taehyung grabbed his jacket. "Yeah." They walked quietly down the corridor, then outside into the night air. No cameras, no staff, just city sounds and shared pace. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. At one point, Jungkook stopped, looking out over the street below. "You're not hiding anymore," he said. Taehyung considered that. "I don't think I ever was." Jungkook smiled faintly. "Maybe, but you're not shrinking now." Taehyung nodded. "Neither are you." They stood there for a moment longer, then turned back. As Taehyung lay in bed later, the quiet felt earned, not forced, not borrowed. He thought about how close losing control had felt and how far that description was from reality. What he had lost wasn't control. It was hesitation. And what replaced it wasn't defiance. It was clarity. The room stayed silent. Not because he had been silenced, but because he had finally drawn a line that held. Time didn't resolve the conversation. It refined it. Days passed, then a week, and the narrative around Taehyung settled into something quieter, more deliberate. The urgency faded, replaced by interpretation instead of interrogation. People spoke less about what he had lost and more about what he had chosen to keep. That distinction mattered. Taehyung felt it most in moments no one documented, between rehearsals, during late-night meals, in the quiet minutes before sleep when the world felt distant and small. He wasn't replaying interviews anymore. He wasn't drafting answers in his head. The mental noise that had once followed him everywhere had thinned. What remained was awareness. During a break in practice, Taehyung sat on the floor, back against the mirrored wall, towel draped loosely around his neck. Jungkook dropped beside him without ceremony, water bottle pressed to his lips. "You've been different," Jungkook said casually. Taehyung glanced sideways. "Good different or noticeable different?" Jungkook smiled. "Same thing." Taehyung let out a quiet laugh. "I think I stopped performing composure." Jungkook nodded slowly. "Yeah, now it just exists." That felt accurate. Later, during a behind-the-scenes shoot, the director offered light direction, then hesitated. "If you want to adjust anything, feel free," they said carefully. Taehyung met their eyes. "This is fine." Not dismissive, not defensive. Final. The shoot moved on without friction. What surprised him wasn't how people adapted, it was how quickly they did. Boundaries, he realized, didn't always require explanation. Often, they just needed consistency. That night, the members gathered quietly after schedules wrapped. No formal meeting, no agenda, just shared space and food, laughter surfacing naturally, unburdened. Seokjin leaned back, arms crossed. "You know they're going to keep speculating, right?" Taehyung nodded. "Of course." Yoongi glanced over. "You don't sound bothered." "I'm not," Taehyung replied. "Speculation isn't pressure anymore. Expectation is." Namjoon considered that. "And you're not carrying it." Taehyung smiled faintly. "I don't need to." Jimin watched him for a long moment, then leaned in briefly, resting his head against Taehyung's shoulder. It was small, familiar, unquestioned. Hoseok broke the quiet with a grin. "You look steadier." Taehyung glanced around the room. "I feel steadier." That was the truth. The next performance was one of the last before a short break. The crowd energy surged, hungry and devoted, voices filling the venue long before the lights dimmed. Taehyung stood backstage, breathing evenly, heart calm. As they stepped into position, Jungkook moved beside him, close enough to feel without touching. "Ready?" Jungkook asked. Taehyung nodded. "Always." The show unfolded without incident, without tension. The kind of night performers remembered not because something went wrong, but because nothing did. Everything aligned. At one point, under a wash of lights, Taehyung caught sight of himself on the big screen. Not the polished idol, not the distant figure. Just himself. Present, unfiltered, unafraid. After the encore, as the crowd slowly dispersed, Taehyung lingered on stage for a moment longer than usual. The silence after the noise felt profound, almost sacred. Jungkook waited nearby. "You good?" Jungkook asked again, the question now familiar but never hollow. Taehyung smiled. "Yeah, I really am." Later, alone in his room, Taehyung sat by the window once more. The city below moved steadily, indifferent and alive. He thought about how often silence had been mistaken for weakness, how composure had been confused with distance. This silence was different. It wasn't restraint. It was choice. His phone buzzed, not with headlines, not with demands. Just a simple message from Jungkook. "Rest well." Taehyung typed back 2 words. "You too." He set the phone down, letting the quiet settle naturally around him. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to correct. Some truths didn't need volume. They just needed space. And for the first time in a long while, Taehyung had given himself exactly that.